board in order to consider adopting proposed amendments to the Town of Middletown rules and regulations regarding the subdivision and development of land. The three items are amend Article 3 of the regulations regarding conservation development. The second one is the board will also consider a recommendation to the Town Council on proposed amendments to the Middletown zoning ordinance, Article 15 regarding multifamily dwellings, and Article 19 regarding conservation development. And the third is to amend Article 4 and Appendix A of the regulations regarding application fees, forms, and checklists. This is a public hearing. It's a public hearing meeting. Speakers from the public will have 5 minutes to speak. I ask that they come to the agenda, to the podium, give their name and address. May I have a motion to open the public hearing?
So moved.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The public hearing is open. We're going to take each of these three items one by one. We will have an introduction by the town planner, open it up, and of course, during that time, members of the board can ask questions of the planner. Then we will open it up to the public, and after the public completes their comments, we will leave the public hearing for the other two items, but we will vote on that first item, move to the second item, do the same thing there, and then move to the third item. Any questions on the procedure? Ron, can you cover that first item, please?
Sure. So these are amendments that have been talked about by the planning board to address concerns with the current procedures and other issues in the conservation development regulations. There are a few, I guess, major changes that are being proposed to address the concerns that have been raised. One is that the revised regulations will require applicants to submit both conventional subdivision and conservation subdivision designs at the first stage of review. And that would be for master plan for a major subdivision and preliminary plan for a minor subdivision if they were proposing a conservation style development as part of a minor subdivision. The other change, or one of the other changes, is a minimum parcel size that would be eligible for conservation development. In the draft that you have, it suggests a 5-acre minimum to be able to do a conservation subdivision, and the concern there was that the conservation concept doesn't work as well on smaller properties where you're getting really small pieces of open space in exchange for reduced lot sizes. So that was a concern that we were trying to address. And then the third, I guess, significant change would be requiring the use of formulas to determine the minimum or the base number of lots as part of a conservation subdivision. The current regulations allow for an applicant to submit a yield plan or use the formula that's in the regulations. The issue with that came up during an application review a while back where language was deemed to be problematic and allowed an applicant to argue that they were allowed a higher or a greater number of lots than would have been allowed by the underlying zoning. So I worked with the solicitor to develop these formulas that are in the draft that you have to really nail down the number of lots that would be allowed in a conservation development, and it is based on what the underlying zoning would permit. The idea of submitting the yield plan, that goes away. You would still be getting, as a result of that prior change I talked about requiring the conventional plans to be submitted, you would still be seeing basically a yield plan because you have two plans in front of you. The conventional plan, which would typically be your yield plan, will show you what would be allowed under the zoning ordinance in the conventional development scenario, and then of course you'll have the conservation design. So you'll still be getting that, I guess, benefit of seeing what a yield plan would look like. It's just that the number of lots in that conservation subdivision is going to be governed, at least initially, by the formula. And as we've talked about in the past, ultimately the planning board makes a decision as to how many lots are going to be allowed. subdivision. So if in the later stages of the review, preliminary plan, for major subdivisions, when the engineering is complete, there'll be an opportunity to reconsider the number of lots that would be allowed based on the engineering studies and work that is done prior to that. So that's, I guess, sort of the three major changes that are made. As you know, and I'm not going to go line by line, but as you look through this, you'll see that there's a section on page 1 and 2, bottom of 1, and top of page 2 that offers some criteria to be used. So as the planning board is given in this draft the discretion to choose between the conservation plan and the conventional plan, it offers you some criteria to make your decision. So the idea is that the planning board, if it wishes to proceed with approving the conventional plan rather than the conservation plan, you would make one of the 4 findings that are on this sheet. And it only needs to be one of the 4, so you don't have to make all 4 findings to make that choice, but at least one of those 4 findings should be made if you're going to choose the conventional plan. So that's that. The rest of all is red. A lot of it is crossing out all of the references and discussion regarding the yield plan. You'll see that on page 4 is where the formulas are provided. And that's basically it for the proposed revisions to Article 3 of the regulations.
Are there any questions of Ron?
Yeah, I have a couple. As I was reading through this, I get a little confused sometimes, but I was taking a look at minor subdivision, and a minor subdivision is defined as having 5 or more units. Or fewer than 5 or less units.
Yes.
And I was getting a little confused because then we were talking about 5 acres for that a conservation development would not be considered on anything less than 5, on a lot less than 5 acres. So 5 acres and 5 units I had to go back and think about that a number of times just because of the number 5.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just my newness to really
Yeah,
understanding these. I'm just pointing that out. I don't know whether, I was just looking kind of on here where it says on a D on page 1, down it says, and prior to preliminary plan approval for minor subdivisions of 5 acres or more.
Yep.
So it just might be a matter of clarifying it in some of the language, just to reiterate that, because never is a minor subdivision defined.
Well, it's defined elsewhere.
It's defined elsewhere, so I had to look elsewhere
Yeah.
to find it.
We don't want, well, the concern would be is having definitions in more than one place in the regulations. Usually you want all your definitions in one place.
Yeah.
So if a definition changes, you don't have to go make multiple.
Yeah, so I did have to go back and look up that definition because I kept thinking that a minor subdivision was 5 acres or less.
Has nothing to do with land area.
Right. So that was sort of a neophyte looking at this. But
Since you're on that note, I'm going to also, I guess, throw another wrinkle at you. Kevin Croft in my office has suggested, and I put in your packet a map of an analysis he did, that the board might want to consider reducing that minimum lot size from 5 acres to 3 acres. And the reason being is that there may be some properties that could benefit from a conservation subdivision design, even though they might be smaller than 5 acres. And particularly on the east side of town where you've got lots of conservation lands, some of these properties, if you look at the map, the blue shaded lots are those that are between 3 and 5 acres. And some of those are abutting either conservation land or larger developable pieces of property. So the thinking is that even though that's a relatively small piece of land, any open space that is preserved by subdividing in a conservation manner might be a abutting or basically joined to an abutting piece of open space, either as a result of a subdivision of a larger property or if it happens to be abutting a conservation parcel. So that was something he suggested that the board might want to consider, and I thought it's a good conversation to have. The 5-acre minimum that we have in there was not based on any science by any means. I think it was just an easy number to pick to have as a minimum parcel size to consider. But again, you look at some of these properties on the east side of town, and there are quite a few, again, shaded in blue, where you've even got some blue parcels that are abutting each other, where if both of those were to be subdivided in a conservation manner, each with its own open space, but abutting the open spaces of those two properties abutting each other would create a larger area of open space. So I'm throwing that out there for your consideration if you would like to revise the amendment to go down to 3-acre minimum.
As I recall, the 5 was an arbitrary selection.
Exactly.
I recall. Ron, can I ask, definition of what Liz was talking about, minor subdivision, 5 lots or less, is that,
It's 5 lots or units.
I'm sorry,
For 5
5
units.
units or less, is that defined, is that a state definition?
Yes.
We can't touch that.
No.
Other questions for Ron? I have a question, Ron. Can the planning board, if an applicant submits both conventional design and a conservation, can the planning board request modifications to those? And the reason I ask that is, after seeing what some of these developers do, which in some cases really go against the spirit of the comprehensive plan, it seemed to me that it's not inconceivable that a developer could come in and do a good job on one and purposely do a lousy job on the other so that the good one would get favored. And I'm wondering if the planning board could request them to, say, redo one of them or both of them.
Well, for the conservation plan, they need to show you what rationale they use to design that plan. There's a 10-step process that they're supposed to follow when they're designing the plan, identifying the areas to be protected, laying out the lots and the roads and all that. So there is a process. So I think during the master plan review, when you're looking at that conservation plan, the applicant, you should ask the applicant to describe what process they went through to design the plan the way it is. And I think that then, they're automatically put on the spot to have to defend why they've done what they've done. And certainly the board can suggest changes at that point.
The only comment I would have on that, Paul, is, yeah, but, is there any way we can maybe encourage applicants to take advantage of the concept review? I know that's a voluntary thing, right, the concept.
Well, they need to come in for at least a pre-application meeting with the staff. That's a requirement, so that happens. I don't know that we can require them to come before the planning board as a concept.
Yeah, so that's a voluntary thing, it always has been, so we can't, require it, but I'm just trying to find a way to maybe get to a point.
Well, if we can certainly ask them to consider modifications, if we're diligent about going through the process or having them go through the process,
Yeah, no,
Things should come
I
up.
agree with that.
things should come up.
I'd like to offer something.
Sure.
I guess I'm part of the problem here because some time ago, I can't remember how many moons ago, but we got word that there was a presentation by DEM on conservation subdivisions. And they had done them out in,
Maybe you might, push them up.
No, it's,
they had done
is it?
successfully passed ordinances out in the country, Coventry and places like that with conservation subdivisions. So we had a briefer came in and he briefed us, and everybody seemed to think it was a good idea. However, in our vision, it was only single-family homes That's what I thought we were going to be dealing with in conservation subdivisions. And we have some clever attorneys in town, not your group necessarily, but
Not clever, get it.
we got into condos now being put into a conservation subdivision, and it really was unsure about the density and everything else.
Yeah.
So
So I've seen the
yeah.
way they present conservation
Yeah.
development, and it comes across very nice. I mean, they capture the essence of what it should be, but it's not practiced that way,
Right.
and that's the problem.
So I'm not
Ron,
sure.
in that
Yeah.
pre-meeting that you have with them, with staff, do you encourage compliance or congruity with the comprehensive plan?
Well, maybe not explicitly. I think as part of the review, we're looking for things that aren't going to fly with the board. And
Oh,
is
so they
very
come in with a
consistent.
plan rather than before they develop a plan?
Typically, they'll come in with a plan, preliminary, well, I won't say preliminary, because that's the
Conceptual
official
slash
term. It's a conceptual
master-ish.
plan of the
Yeah,
proposed
it's a
subdivision.
quasi-type.
Sometimes they'll have two different options that they'll want to
Yeah.
bounce off the staff,
Right.
yeah,
Or three, it could be several that they're trying to
yeah.
move if it's a complicated
But as
site.
we're, yeah, so as we're sitting with them in that venue, trying to advise them, you know, we're going along the lines of wanting them to do what the board wants, what the town wants, and what the comprehensive plan calls for.
So as you're going through that, certainly if they're doing something that is beyond or outside the scope of an ordinance, you will tell them.
Yes.
But what if it's not really in the spirit of the comprehensive plan? Do you tell them about that?
Well, I guess I'd have to ask, what do you mean by the spirit of the comprehensive
Well,
plan?
I mean,
You
whether
know,
we
there's
like it or
very-
not, there are places where subjectivism enters into this evaluation. And, I mean, I always go back to Middletown Storage, you know, where they put up this monster building right beside a residential property. And they were in compliance with ordinances, but they, one could argue that they weren't consistent with the comprehensive plan where the plan says the facility must fit into the neighborhood, or it must be compatible with neighboring properties. That's subjective. So, by the way, I think that's another case where they went to the zoning board with a different plan that they presented to us.
Okay.
I do. Anyway, any other discussion on this point?
Well, I guess I know better than us even discuss this, but the world would be perfect if the conservation subdivision was segregated only to single-family homes. And of course, that's never going to fly. But that would really, I think, prevent some of the things that have happened, and I think violate the spirit of it with the condos particularly.
I think what violated the spirit of the ordinance was the one we had on Maple Avenue,
Yeah,
frankly.
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
But I
It
think,
wasn't the fact that it was condos, it was the number.
right, that's what I was getting at, is the fact that it was condos. I think if this were in place, they weren't even gonna be there, and it wouldn't have fallen under that. So I think semantics on single-family dwelling condos, they're units, I think, and if they're compatible in the neighborhood, they can be made to be compatible, then I don't see the harm in including, I guess you could say, condos or multi-family units.
Well, I think before, this has been reworked by the solicitor and the planner now, there's no real question about what the yield's going to be. It's going to be clearly defined now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's been the thing hanging out in
Agreed,
space.
that's the
Yeah.
crux of it,
Yeah.
yes.
Any other comments for Ron?
Yeah, I just would love a little bit of an explanation on the yield formula, what that really, how that makes it more protective of sort of the numbers that are, the yield that, the number of units they'll be able to put, or the number of
Because
lots that
it's-
will be able to be on.
By
the-
using the formula, it dictates the number of units you're going to get. The problem was, under the current language, in that case on Maple Avenue, was I guess the poster child, the applicant argued that there was language under the current regulations that left it open to the discretion of the planning board as to how many units could reasonably be accommodated on the property. So even though we have a formula in the current regulations now that is very similar in how it would work, how it works with these new formula, but it has that additional language in the current regs that was seen as being ambiguous and allowing the planning board a lot of discretion. So there were, again, it was approved for many more units than what would have been allowed under the underlying zoning.
It's a horrible development. I just think it's awful.
Any other
I think
comments?
it's awful.
One other definition, including only developable land. I couldn't find a definition for
It's in the zoning
developable land.
ordinance.
It's in the zoning ordinance?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back
Yes.
and look for it, but
Very
I didn't.
well established and well used.
Well
yes,
oiled.
okay.
Well oiled.
I will go back and look for it again. It wasn't in the conservation development
Right, it's in the
definitions,
zoning
in the zoning ordinance.
Any other comments for
Okay.
Rob? Any other comments, Rob? Any comments from the public? Anyone wish to make comments? Please, come up and state your name and address, please.
Lisa Kinsella, 104 Peckham Lane.
Speaking to the microphone.
Sorry. Lisa Kinsella, 104 Peckham Lane.
Where do you live? I'm sorry.
104 Peckham Lane.
Peckham Lane, okay.
Just a couple questions I have. The 10-step that you have to go through for a CSD, does that have to all be answered at master plan stage? All those?
Yes, they're required to provide the discussion and in the materials that defend or explain how they went through the 10-step process.
Justification.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and that's all at master's
Yes.
plans? Okay. One of the, I've done some reading on the conservation developments, and I've noticed that in a lot of towns and in the Rhode Island Manual, the average open space percentage is 50 to 70%. So for Middletown, we're maxed out in R60 at 45%, which is so really low for a town that wants to keep a rural feel. And I was just wondering what the history was on that decision.
That's been in place since the ordinance was first adopted. I can't remember exactly where the percentages came from.
Okay. There's no special reason why we're so low
It
in
was-
open space
I'm
percentage?
sure it was part of the discussion with the planning board that existed at that time and went through the town council.
When did that go through? When did that conversation, or
I don't want to give you a date because I can't remember off the top of my
a year,
head.
maybe?
It's been at least, I'd say 7, 8 years.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can I ask you, you said that you did some reading, and could you repeat that, where you based your,
Where I got the 50 to 70% is in the Rhode Island Manual of Conservation Development.
and that's
That's
a
a guide.
guide, and that's what you believe,
That's for a lot of, in Rhode Island, that these conservation development developers are using that guide. In fact, some that have come before you have used that guide.
but do you know what other towns fall under? I mean, that's a guide, correct, but like, Middletown used that guide when developing it 6 or 7, 8 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and ended at this number. So I guess if other cities or jurisdictions have used that guide, then I would like to know maybe where those towns are, and if, they may very well have ended up back where Middletown was at the same, general number.
They didn't list it in that guide, it just said on average, and even above and beyond that manual, if you look outside of Rhode Island, 50% or more is very normal. So 45 and 40 is just, on average, is low. So I was just curious what was the reasoning behind that, that's all. And
I think when we picked that number, it probably had a lot less to do with actual thinking, but it was based on, I think, the number of lots we had that were in the R20, R40, where 25% would seem to be a reasonable percentage. If we had hundreds of R60 lots, you got a lot more, obviously bigger parcels, and you could possibly carve out more conservation space. But that, at that time when we were doing it, appeared to, again, based on those number of R40, R20 lots, seemed to be a reasonable number at that time.
okay.
So it wasn't founded in any other specific fundamental idea.
And I don't, I'd like to see examples of maybe where it hasn't met that. There's a, you know, a problem with it, you know, if that number should have been higher. For the-
I'm not trying to
I know.
judge, I'm just trying to
No, I know, but I'm trying to work
understand
through
it,
my
that's
mind
all.
also. So anyway, I'll let you finish.
That's, well, that's okay. Another quick, my last question, it was just the yield plan calculation. Right now, so this developable land, and you take away what's needed for roads, is that right? So, if a road now is supposed to be 26 feet wide, right? I know that's kind of on the fence right now, but currently it's 26, and then oftentimes it's dropped to 24. So now there's some land that's left. There's 2 feet by however long the road is. What happens to that land? Does that get put into the developable land percentage?
So
or-
the way it works is you start with your developable land area, so a raw piece of land,
Mhm.
and then you apply the formula to that raw piece of land. And the formula, it's a rough approximation of the amount of land that would be needed out of the raw land to accommodate the roads and the drainage infrastructure. So the formula in the existing regulations, it's an 80%. You multiply the developable land area by 80%, and that gives you the number that you divide by to get the number of lots, or you divide into to get the number of lots. So you're basically taking 20% of the land away to accommodate anticipated roads and drainage. And it's an approximation,
So,
and it's based on what we see and what I did and others have done in other places. As you look at what happens in a conventional development scenario, you take a conventional subdivision plan, you look at how much land is there, you subtract out the area for the roads. In most cases, 20% is about right for the amount of land that's needed for roads. So that's
So,
where that comes from.
Ron, regardless of what the paved width of the road is, there's a right of way.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with.
There's nothing to do with the paved width, it's the right of way.
The right of way width.
Change the numbers one way or the other.
No.
Not the road, not the width of the road, the right of way is what
The
governs
right
that.
of way is what,
Okay.
so it's the 50-foot right of way that we're accommodating with that 20%, not the paved width.
Okay, okay, great, thanks, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from the public? Okay, at this time, we will terminate the public discussion of this, but the public hearing will stay open for the other items. On this item, may I have a motion to have the planning board adopt these modifications and forward them to the town council for ratification?
So moved.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes.
Oh. Did we reduce the acreage?
You didn't.
Um,
If you want to, you can.
Can we revisit that
Well,
on the suggestion?
we can open that up for discussion.
Should I withdraw my motion, Art would withdraw the second, I guess, to be...
Well, we've moved that. I'm willing to entertain a motion to re-examine the minimum size.
Okay.
So moved.
Is there a second on that motion?
Second.
Okay, there's a motion to re-examine the minimum size lot for conservation development. Is there any discussion?
The minimum area.
Minimum
The
size
minimum.
lot.
So Kevin is suggesting 5 down to 3, based on his analysis.
Well, he suggested that the board look at it and consider it, given that there's the potential that some properties that are under 5 acres could still benefit from being divided in a conservation plan versus a conventional plan.
So it was enough for him to have to bring it up and suggest it, so...
And the other thing that I would just throw out there too is that along with the other changes, one of the changes is that the board will have the discretion to choose between the conventional plan and the conservation plan of any subdivision that is brought to you. So if you see a conservation subdivision come in on a piece of property under 5 acres that you don't think makes any sense, the applicant is told that he must submit, or well, he will submit it, but he would
It's
have
still
to
an
proceed with the conventional plan. So there is that check. The planning board has that discretion.
I don't have a problem going down to 3.
On this map, Ron, there's a blue and then a dark blue that's labeled contiguous ownership. What does that mean?
Means that those lots are owned by the same people.
By the
So
same
if you've got
person?
2 lots that are blue,
The dark blue.
dark blue, those 2 lots are owned by the same people.
And they'd likely be combined for development
It
purposes.
looks like it's just one situation.
Yeah, I don't see many on there, if any
No,
one.
that's a very
maybe
small,
a couple.
very small percentage.
Couple, actually. There's a couple over here.
So what's the zoning on those ones that are 3 to 5 acres? Are they
Well,
in?
it varies.
They're varied, so
They're gonna be responsible for meeting the zoning in that, whatever zone they're in.
Yeah, it doesn't impact the number of lots that they're going to get. The only question is whether they'd be allowed to propose a
a
conservation.
conservation, so whether it's one house in a conservation or 2, so if they're gonna subdivide, it would have to be a minimum of 2
Right.
on a 3 to 5 acre. So it could be 2 to whatever the
It depends on the zoning district.
Head of the, right, the
zoning
district. is-
district.
Yeah.
right.
I just don't know what the ramifications of that would be. I haven't
Well,
Well,
I think,
really thought about
I
that.
guess what I'm suggesting is that you would, as a board, be looking at these things on a case-by-case basis.
Basis
So,
anyway.
and you would have the ability to decide that if it's a situation that it doesn't make any sense, like we've seen plans come through, the reason we're doing this exercise is because we've seen plans come through for conservation developments that don't make much sense. The board now, with these amendments, would have the discretion to say, no, in this case, you're going to go forward with the conventional plan, you're not going to do the conservation plan.
Yeah.
And my only comment was that if Kevin flagged it or thought it was worthy of discussion and Ron's presenting it, I don't have a problem with moving in that direction. I think it's valid, but we still have our checks either way.
Yeah.
And we had to start with a number, like we picked 5 after Kevin analyzed it. I'm sure he went through some pretty good exercise. He created a map. You know, it might not be a bad idea to maybe take a deeper look at it if you're not comfortable with it.
I personally would like to take a deeper look at these properties. When I'm looking at a map, I'm not really sure the properties that I'm looking at here, kind of what neighborhoods they're in. And
Well,
I
we picked 5 without looking at it because it was recommended. And now, after some analysis, Kevin's recommending 3 might be better. We still, no matter what it is, 3, 2, 7, we have the last word as to which one we choose. It'll be either conservation or conventional.
We're not opening up any more parcels, I guess we are technically, to potential conservation development.
Yeah.
We are, by changing that number from 5 to 3.
The board has the final
But we
say.
still have the final say, but I think without having to go through an exercise, if a developer is sitting there with a parcel of land that is 4 acres, and it fits for a conservation, he doesn't have to go through the exercise of explaining why he needs to do this. I think he should go ahead and do it anyway, but then he'd have to wait for us to kind of say, hey, we think it fits.
Because he'd have to get a waiver, right, in order to
Would that be a
do
waiver?
a conservation development on a
Would he? Yeah.
smaller piece of land,
It's
on a smaller parcel.
It's not allowed.
The way this is worded now, you wouldn't be allowed.
You
to.
wouldn't be
not
allowed to.
Yeah, it's not allowed. Art, you had a comment?
I think 3 is fine.
You think 3
I
is
could go to
fine?
3, yeah.
BJ? Can I have a motion to modify that portion of the article from 5 acre minimum to a 3 minimum acre?
So moved.
Second,
Motion's made and seconded. Discussion.
I'm just, it's a new concept. It's just like I want to give it a little bit more thought. But, when thinking about affordable housing, if you've got you've got a parcel of land and you can put a couple of more units on it. You can do the same units closer together in a smaller zoning. It might create more affordable housing on some of these smaller lots, and I'm in favor of that.
That's what this is doing, though.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
kind of what it's doing. So, you
Yeah.
know, with that concept in mind and thinking about, you know, one of the, you know, tenets here of conservation housing is to offer alternative and conventional, you know, well, it's in here somewhere, where it talks about diversity of lot sizes
Sure.
and densities and price points on houses. So I would be in favor of the 3 to 5. With that in mind, that's the motivation behind it. So as we're granting this, we have to
Fair.
remember to talk about the motivations, the rationale behind these conservation
Yeah.
developments that, you know, this list, I'm really glad to see this list here of what it is that we're looking to achieve through the conservation development, and whether that's on a 3-acre lot or a 30-acre lot,
Yep.
the objective is still the same.
Absolutely.
Any further discussion? The motion is to reduce that minimum size from 5 acres to 3 acres for conservation development. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes. We move to item 1B. The board will also consider a recommendation to the town council on proposed amendments to the Middletown zoning ordinance, Article 15 regarding multifamily dwellings, and Article 19 regarding conservation development. Ron?
So these changes, proposed changes are really just making the zoning consistent with what we're doing through the regulations. References the formula, eliminates reference to the yield plan. There's some changes to Article 15 regarding townhomes. On the bottom of page 3, you'll see that as it currently reads, you're required in a conservation development with townhomes to have a separate lot for each townhome, which makes absolutely no sense. I'm not sure why we put that in there to begin with. And that was, I believe,
That's your community garden plot,
I
right?
guess.
It's a 4x4.
I believe that one of the applicants that's come through recently, I had to seek a variance from the zoning board to avoid having to do that. Again, it's something that I don't know why it was in there to begin with, but it doesn't make any sense in a condo situation to have each condo unit on a separate lot. So those are the changes to Article 15 regarding multifamily, and then, of course, Article 19 is the zoning ordinance provisions related to conservation development. And again, removing reference to the yield plan, referencing the formula. I guess, significant change being proposed is that on page 5, under permitted uses, residential use, we're proposing eliminating the R30 district from being allowed to do multifamily, and I think that I'm trying to remember back to why that happened. I think it was a concern over the style of development occurring in the R30 and larger districts. There's a reason why we didn't include the R40 and R60 districts for townhomes, because those are,
I'm hard pressed to find where R30 exists now. There can't be many R30 districts.
there is along
Paradise
East
Avenue?
Main Road,
Paradise?
up by Rhode Island Nurseries and across from Rhode Island Nurseries, that's all R30. Paradise
Paradise?
Avenue, there's some
Paradise, yeah,
R30.
okay, right.
So there are areas, but a lot of it is on the east side of town. And so I think that's where that recommended change came from, is trying to keep the townhome multifamily style of development in the more dense zoning districts, R10, R20, and the residential multifamily districts.
I get that, I remember that.
Any other questions for Ron?
Nope.
Is there anyone in the public who would like to address this topic? May I have a motion to make a recommendation to the town council on the proposed amendments to Article 15 and Article 19 as per the October 26,
moved.
18 draft?
Second?
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion?
Oh, just Ron, on the, since we've changed it to 3 on the bottom of page 4, involving less than 5
Yeah, I'll make
acres,
those
needs to be
changes to this.
adjusted. Okay,
Yeah,
just wanted to make sure.
yeah.
Oh, that's right, I didn't forget about that.
Good catch, yeah.
Good catch, yeah, so motion's amended to
Motion is amended to make that change.
make that change. Anywhere else, Ron, do you, based on?
I don't think so.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion passes. Item 1C, amend Article 4 and Appendix A of the regulations regarding application fees, forms, and checklists. Ron?
So this is something completely separate from the conservation. These are the fees that we had a meeting about or discussed during a meeting a while back, revising the application fees based on the actual costs of doing the reviews, and this is cost for municipal staff. Applicants are responsible for paying for outside review, the third-party review that we often have on applications. That's a separate thing that is paid for by the applicant. So these are the application fees paid to the town that are intended to offset the cost of the staff time in doing processing and the reviews of applications. It also, it introduces for the first time a fee for development plan review applications, which we've never had. Those applications, the only fees that are typically paid are when they're seeking zoning relief, so, which often happens for commercial developments. They are coming through the development plan review process, but they're also going through the zoning board process, usually either for a variance or a special use permit, so they're paying those fees, but they haven't paid a separate fee for development plan review. So this will institute a fee again to offset the estimated cost of the staff and staff time for reviewing those applications.
Ron, are these fees similar to what other towns and communities have too? Do
The
you know?
fees charged by other towns are all over the place, really, to be honest with you. There are fees that are lower than what the town now charges. There are some towns that charge much higher fees. What the town administrator has advised, and this goes back to a review of building permit fees that was done probably a year ago. The town was arguing at the state level for the ability to charge what it wanted for building permit fees. The state was trying to implement a statewide building. Bill, you probably heard about this.
They did, because of the suit from the Rhode Island builders, so.
Yeah, so Sean Brown went through the effort with Jack Kane to really lay out, analyze what it was costing town staff to do the application and permit reviews. So using that same idea, that's what I used, is trying to estimate exactly what it is, the amount of time that Middletown and staff people are putting into doing the reviews of applications. I can't tell you how many other towns came up with their fees, but at least we would be able to defend our fees. If it ever came to an issue, no one's ever challenged our fees, but if for some reason someone were to challenge our fees as being too high, there's a rationale for how they were
Yeah.
calculated.
So as I was involved in that exercise that Ron just described, that was much of the same verbiage that they used to determine their fees. They had to justify that. There was a suit from the Rhode Island builders because the fees were too high, and certain communities had to justify, and that's the exercise that many communities, jurisdictions went through to arrive at the fee that they were proposing. So I think it's right in line
Where
with
is that to be spent?
right in line with where we need to be.
So as I was doing that, I started looking at the checklist, and I've given these to you before. I went through all the application forms and checklists and made a lot of miscellaneous revisions to bring these up to date. To institute on the application checklist the fees as contained in that fee schedule, but then also update things. For example, our current checklist calls for blue line prints of subdivision applications. Nobody does blue line prints anymore, so bringing the forms up to date. There's some new, I guess, classifications of surveying that are now being used, so I added that language. Class 1 comprehensive boundary surveys are what the new checklist would require, which is the new standard. There's, like I said, there's other miscellaneous revisions, updates, corrections. A lot of the changes to, as you get to the bottom here, the checklist for the development plan reviews. I've added some language that the administrative officer, although I spelled it wrong, but the administrative officer would have the ability to determine whether some of those items on the checklist are applicable or not. A lot of times what happens when we get an application in, some of the things on the checklist aren't applicable, so it would allow the administrative officer to determine whether all of the items are applicable or not.
That's a good provision.
Just so you know, you still have Mylar, original drawing on Mylar.
We do require
You do
that.
require that?
Yes, the final
Oh, my gosh.
recording.
Administrative, but just on the administrative subdivision checklist.
Well, it should be on all of them, but
Oh, okay.
the
I was just,
town- the
I haven't
town-
even heard the word Mylar in years.
Yeah, the town requires Mylar plans for recording.
Recording, yeah. It's-
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing, I sort of standardized the number of copies that the town requires.
5.
They were all over the place, the
Yeah.
number of copies are required for various applications. So this will kind of standardize the number of copies that we need for submission. So that's, I don't know if there's any questions, it's a lot of miscellaneous.
Ron, on page 6 of the major subdivision master plan checklist, the very last line, there was this error, reference source not found, and it's still there.
Yeah,
Final plan checklist.
yeah, you pointed that out to me before.
I know.
I'll fix that.
Any other comments for Ron?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there is an appropriate place on the master plan and preliminary plan checklist to have compliance with the Middletown Comprehensive Town Plan, Comprehensive Plan.
No, these are submission requirements, so these are the documents that need to be submitted with the application, so you as a board and the applicant needs to
That's for us to,
defend how his plan is compliant, and it's for you to decide whether it's compliant, but there's, I guess I wouldn't be sure what document or what they would be submitting.
okay. I just, you know, we have to make a decision based on whether we think that it's compliant with the town plan. And I know in some of the subdivisions, there've been narratives that have been submitted along with their plans, where they talk about compliance with the comprehensive town plan. Those narratives, are they required, or is that at the?
They're not required. I suppose you could request a narrative be submitted, but I'd have to think some more. We would want to be somewhat specific as to what you want to have in that narrative.
But that really, the narratives that I've seen are at the pleasure of the applicant.
Yeah.
Because they often say things in those narratives that are, you know, are telling about their future plans for that
Right.
contiguous properties and such, so I find them helpful.
The board can always ask for something
Mhm.
like that when the applicant comes before you. If you would like to have some information described in writing, for example, how
Mhm.
the applicant feels that the plan is compliant with the comprehensive plan, you can ask them to provide something in writing.
Okay.
At the hearing, at the presentation,
Yeah.
not necessarily at application stage. Not necessarily as a required part of the submission
Right.
for.
Right. Yeah.
but certainly at the meeting, absolutely.
I was just curious, because I do find
Good
those
call.
narratives helpful.
Yes,
And I didn't know
definitely.
whether they
Yeah.
were, a checklist item or could be a checklist item. If that was something that the planning board found.
Yeah, I suppose
The
it could be,
plan.
but again, then we'd have to go back and really think about what
Mhm.
components would you want to have in that narrative, which, I mean, we could do, but maybe that's,
Paul,
It's good to have the conversation, so it
Yeah.
just reinforces our ability to ask for that if we feel it's necessary.
yeah, you can do that.
is, in the spirit of that, and what you said earlier about having the discretion to ask for, to waive the requirement if you don't feel it's appropriate, can we add maybe some language to the other development stages to allow you some discretion to, in other words, many times when I've seen these lists, they become all-inclusive, and if a applicant can come in and say, I've given you all of this, so hence I should get an approval, or hence I should move forward to the next step. But also many times, I think if the administrative officer can have some discretion and not require it, or frankly require something that you feel is going to be helpful to the board to make a decision, knowing the makeup of the board, you tend to know what certain members ask for over time. I'm not trying to be specific here, but I'm saying to give the administrative officer some discretion to in other words, saying that these lists are not all inclusive, and at the discretion of the administrative officer, more or less may be required. It may not be enforceable, but I think it gives you that discretion that you described earlier.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the point. I don't think you can put that in writing, that the administrative officer has the discretion to ask for whatever he wants. I think it's gotta be,
That's not what I'm suggesting, though.
but I think,
I think maybe more a lighter language to give the applicant some direction, because, on the other side of that, Ron, the applicants can come into TRC or your office and say, look, you've got everything that's on this list. So, we want a decision, or we want to move forward, and take the hard stand on it. Maybe that's not
I think that's asking Ron to do our business, and we shouldn't be doing
some
that.
of that discussion does happen in the pre-application
Yeah.
meetings and at the TRC meetings, and then ultimately at the planning board
Yeah.
meetings. If you all feel like you need something, you ask
We
the
ask for
applicant
it, yeah.
Maybe just some language that this list is not all-inclusive? I mean, 'cause
So the purpose of the checklist is
Or
to
that,
get,
or that the
is to get
planning
the-
board may make additional,
yeah, just
request.
some language like that?
but I don't, what I was gonna say is I don't think you even need to do that, because the purpose of this checklist is to get somebody on the planning board agenda and to get
Okay.
a review started.
All right, that's fair.
See, I've felt in some of the meetings that, if the applicant has gone through the checklist, that we don't really have a choice but to approve it.
No, that's not what I've heard them say. I've heard them say that they've met the regulations.
Okay,
they-
so,
they
but the
meet-
checklist
The
is kind of,
checklist is just, like I said, it's the minimum amount of information to get somebody on the
Yeah, that's a good
agenda
point.
and start the
That's
review
good.
process.
I can live with that.
yeah.
As the review proceeds, and Sean knows this as good as anyone else, through the TRC and then ultimately the planning board, the applicants oftentimes are asked to provide additional
Much more.
information. So
Or less, frankly, if it's not appropriate.
that happens, and it should happen.
Sure.
But I don't think I don't think you can have an open-ended initial checklist.
Yeah, that wasn't my
Yeah.
intent, but I was just looking to give you a little more discretion to cover yourself in case somebody wants to take that hard line stance on the application. I've experienced it previously, but I guess not enough to
Yeah, I
make
think
it.
the more that, going back to what Liz was saying, I think what you've heard more is that applicants will say, I meet all of the requirements.
requirements,
Right.
We're
right.
not talking about the checklist.
Right. And I was associating the checklist with the requirements, but the checklist really is what they need to do in order to get on the agenda
Right.
of the planning board, to make a submission. And
So-
that's a very different.
Absolutely.
That's a very different
So,
requirement.
well, I think I've been scarred in the past with not necessarily applicants, but frankly, planning board members who say, well, I don't see, you don't have this it's not on the checklist, so, you didn't check it off, it's not there, I don't see it, so, I don't want to hear this application tonight, I'm going to move it back. That's where my thought process started from, was having planning board members in my previous town hold up applications. So maybe we want to prevent it in that respect.
Well, typically, we don't let something get to you before it's determined to be complete, so
Understood,
there
but
shouldn't be anything missing.
I've had planning board members in my office looking at the checklists and waiting and holding that card until they absolutely needed it at the meeting. The checklist, because it's public record, they get a hold of it. It's happened to me more than a couple of times, but that's, that's maybe an extreme case. Not extreme, but it does happen. So I guess that's where my thought process was, but you can't put writing to accommodate for every possible scenario. It's just not possible. I have to recognize that. So anyway, I'm done.
Any other comments?
Well, I think something else we can use from time to time, when to engage the TRC. We normally don't do the TRC until after the master plan, but maybe the TRC, a quick look at the master plan.
They've been reviewing master plans for major subdivisions.
Okay.
They'll review the preliminary
Yeah.
plan when it comes in. So that happens on major subdivision, that
Yeah.
happens regularly.
But I wonder if we should do it for all subdivisions. It's just another filter that I think goes through the checklist and looks at some things that may or may not be a little tricky for us to decide without their advice. So how would we do that? Would we have to,
Well, I don't know that needs to be in the regulations. I think it would just probably be
case-by-case basis?
case by case, or just direction to me that you would like to have the TRC review all subdivision applications.
Yeah.
So that's discretion, but it doesn't
At your
necessarily have to be
discretion.
written.
Under the state law, the planning board basically runs the TRC, and you can refer anything you want to the TRC for review.
I think particularly in complicated cases, we've got at least one or two of those on Tuckerman, which it's certainly not a major subdivision, but it is complicated, and there's a lot of legal business on both sides that needs to be, I think, filtered and translated into something that we can work with.
That one is at the TRC, so.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions for Ron? Is there anyone in the public who would like to address this topic? Please. State your name and address, please.
Lisa Kinsella, 104 Peckham Lane. Through many of the meetings that I've sat through, there seems to be a lot of confusion on the power of the comprehensive plan and the power of zoning. And last night at the zoning board, myself and some of the people were very surprised to hear that zoning actually trumps the comprehensive plan. I guess I was wondering how can that be when it takes 7 years? You can only change a comprehensive plan every 7 years?
No, it can be amended up to 4 times a year.
So, but isn't it easy, and again, I'm just trying to educate myself, I'm not looking to make problems. I just,
I wasn't there last night, so I don't know what the context was, but the way it works under the state law is if there's a discrepancy between what zoning says and what the comprehensive plan says, state law says that the zoning rules. Basically, it's the town's responsibility to put its comprehensive plan into action by amending the zoning ordinance,
okay,
as necessary.
State law.
So if there is some continuing inconsistencies between the two, state law says that the zoning will then rule.
okay. So as a resident, when you see inconsistencies, how do you start that process of, I guess, town council? Where do you start the process of saying, hey, can we have a discussion about this inconsistency? Can a resident do that?
You can start with the planning board and
Okay.
submit something in writing as to amendments to the zoning that you think are necessary.
Okay. And is that typically where it starts, is with a resident saying something, or the planning board
It can
saying
be.
something?
It can be, sure.
I would suggest that you those are valid questions, and I think we have, in case you didn't know, we have the best planner in the state of Rhode Island, sitting right there. Really, use him in his office. He's very accommodating. He will answer those questions and guide you, but you might end up in front of the council, might end up in front of this board, but I think,
Okay.
you know, really lean on town staff like that, because we have some very good land use people that we need to take advantage of.
So either the planning board can initiate a change or an amendment to the zoning based on something that they come up on their own or is brought to them by a resident, or a resident, a property owner, or an applicant can petition the town council for a zoning amendment. If it's a formal petition to the town council for a zoning amendment, it gets referred to the planning board for review before the council acts on it. So one way or the other, the planning board is gonna get it.
Great, thank
But
you.
one-
And
one
you
is-
should be aware that the planning board has initiated and completed some items to bring the comprehensive plan or bring the zoning closer to the comprehensive plan. And we still have some items on the table that are being addressed. Just takes time.
Yeah, that was mentioned last night.
Yeah.
The discussions had already started, they've sort of drifted off for other things. So I was
Yeah,
just
but I think it's important to understand that state law is very important, because in previous comp plans I worked on, there was absolutely no action taken after the comp plan was put into effect, and there were huge inconsistencies with zoning, and it caused all kinds of legal problems, and that was throughout the state. So what we're doing now is what Mr. Croce just said. We were supposed to get that stuff done within a year. There's too much. So we're trying to cover the bases and have that done. I would also say there's some people on the town council don't understand that process either. So, but if you start with the planner and work with us on cases and interest, we'll be happy to support you on that.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the public who would like to comment? Please.
Sean Bouchard from Silva Thomas, Martland, and Offenburg, 1100 Aquidneck Avenue. I just figured I'd throw my 2 cents in connection with Mr. Nash's comments related to the checklist. From an applicant standpoint, right, when you're putting together your application and trying to get all the documentation together, you really need those checklists to understand what it is that you need to provide to the board so that way you can actually be heard, right? So that is separate and apart from the zoning ordinance or the planning regs that we have to comply with as an application. That is strictly basically a procedural, can we get that through? And I can attest from experience that there have been plenty of times when Ron or the TRC have indicated to an applicant that yes, this is all, you are prepared to go forward, but there's additional documentation that may need to be submitted if we need to flesh out a point in more detail, right? So if there's additional questions related to stormwater or something like that, those are absolutely supplemented and will be done. And as an applicant, if you don't do that, you're simply taking, the board at their mercy that they're going to somehow ignore that fact and make a decision without full information that they don't feel comfortable with. So, from an applicant standpoint, I don't think it's necessarily necessary to add additional language to the checklist to provide additional, discretion or something like that, when it's really simply for us to know how many plans do we need, what needs to be on the plans, so that way we can have an effective discussion to then come to the board and have that presentation heard. And if there's questions or anything that need to be answered at that time, that still comes up. And the other point I would make in connection with the comprehensive plan and narratives submitted to Ron or something, I mean, that's really kind of the purview of the board, and that's your power is you're responsible for the comprehensive plan and the being in compliance. So if there's questions related to that, that's really not necessarily something we would be submitting to Ron for his determination. That's not his role. That would be the board's role. And so if that's something that needs to be provided, and there are certain some applications are very there's no necessity really. That's not the main concern. But in others, obviously, compliance comes to the fore, and that's something that the applicant would be aware of and would need to provide additional detail. But that's really kind of case specific, and that's something that an applicant would know, coming before the board, what they would need to provide at that time. So, I think obviously there's concern, but I think from an applicant standpoint, there's plenty of obligations on their part that they have to comply with, and I think it's very clear that there's a give and take that goes on between the board, the applicant, as well as, the planning staff and the applicant. And I think everything seems to work fairly well from that side of things. I think the bigger issue is trying to come up with, clarity in the actual planning regs themselves.
Great,
So,
thank you.
yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to speak?
Make a motion to close the public hearing?
Second.
Motion is made and seconded to close the public hearing. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Public hearing is closed. May I have a motion to amend Articles 4 and Appendix A of the regulations as per the agenda document?
So moved.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Is there any discussion?
I'd just like to say, job well done on that, Ron. There was a lot of,
Yeah.
Oh,
I-
yeah, definitely, Ron. I know how that
a lot of work
goes.
on that,
Yes.
so thank you for those little tweaks that are, it means a
Time
lot.
consuming, I know it
You know.
is.
It's a lot of work. Appreciate it.
Time consuming. Very much appreciated.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes. Is there anything else to come before this meeting? Did you want to mention next meeting, or should we just hold off on
I think we'll wait.
that? All right.
Yeah, let's hold off for a minute.
May I have a motion to adjourn?
Which meeting?
Second.
Motion's made and seconded to adjourn. Oh,
No, that's okay, I'm voting, yes.
all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion's adjourned.